This podcast contains explicit content and is intended for mature audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Don't say we didn't warn you. Hey everyone, it's Hannah.
And I'm Madison.
And you are listening to Who's Knocking?
A true crime podcast.
That's right. And today we are back. We are doing part 2 of our series on Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka, aka the Ken and Barbie killers.
Ew.
Yeah, we are back. We are here to dive back into this disgusting pool of information.
Yeah.
Okay, first of all, I was telling you this before, but as I continued researching, I kept finding contradictory information. Of course. I feel like that's really normal for a lot of true crime cases, and anything that's unsubstantiated, I will say if it is. But when we get into this episode, I will add in a couple like extra pieces of information I found that pertain to last time, just for food for thought for everybody. So last episode, I talked about Paul and Karla's childhoods, how they met, and basically like everything about their relationship before they became serial killers together. Just the good old days. So today we're going to get into what's definitely the worst parts of this case, which is the crimes that they committed together.
Because up to now, they have not, it's only Paul who's been raping.
Yes.
And that's pretty much
And as far as we know, Karla didn't know, although, again, different sources say different things. Some people say she knew and got off on it. Some people say she didn't know and would have been shocked to find out. Like it's,
and that's stuff that you could just never know. Like you can't know
I don't
what's
think
in
it's
someone's
possible.
mind.
Yeah, exactly. So,
and I guess just another heads up, which we headsed up about last time, but it's a lot of sexual assault.
Yeah.
So if that's bothersome for you, this is not an episode for you, perhaps.
Yeah, definitely extra explicit content warning. There's a lot of details out there about this case because there are publicly released video transcripts of their crimes, which I will get into because some of that is really, really significant, obviously, to the events of the case and also the events of like the whole trials and everything. But I don't want to include anything that's not necessary because it is pretty graphic. Yeah. But that information is out there. Specifically, the book that I read, Lethal Marriage, has full transcripts of a lot of the specific events. So if you're interested, you can check that out. But I will include a lot of details still. So still explicit content warning and everything that I think is like really relevant to the case, but also what I think is relevant to kind of like the psychology of Paul and Karla. I did include a lot of those details.
Yeah, you can't talk about this case without getting into some graphic details.
Yeah,
That's just what it is.
I know. I didn't want to go past the point of like what's really necessary because it's really repetitive. It's kind of the same stuff over and over, but there will be graphic details. So prepare yourself, brace yourself, be ready for it. Be ready. Okay. It won't be as bad. No one's arm is getting cut off. It won't be as, it won't be as graphic as that.
Cool.
That's our benchmark for.
Yeah. If you could handle anthill kids, you'll be cool.
This is not compared to that. So actually, I don't know. We'll let everyone be the judge.
Yeah, judge it yourself.
So we will pick up in December of 1990, and today's episode is going to cover between December 1990 to about June 1991. So about a year and a half of horribleness from Paul and Karla. But let me do a really quick recap. Still, everyone listen to the first part of the first episode part if you haven't, but we'll do a really quick recap. So December 1990, at this point, Paul and Karla have been engaged for about a year, and they've been together for over 3 years. And as far as we know, unknown to Karla, Paul had committed 11 known rapes during the years that they'd been dating, with a couple of them, like 2 of them were a few months before they met, as far as we know.
Yeah, probably way more.
Honestly, yes. And also a lot of people online on the good old internet say that it started way before, like Paul was raping way before. So as far as we know, 11.
Really successful rap career also.
Oh my God.
Which also
there's more about that this episode.
Okay, Chris was, I told him a little bit about it and he's like, does he call himself the Scarborough Rapist?
No, missed opportunity.
So
he didn't have like a rap name for himself, which was too bad because his raps were extremely, extremely cringy and wouldn't have minded going more down that path. But It will come up again.
Okay.
One of the worst tortures he commits is making people listen to his rap music. Okay, so Paul and Carla were in a long-distance relationship for most of the time they were dating. Oh, right. So Carla was in St. Catharines, which is a few hours drive from Paul's hometown of Scarborough, Ontario. So based on that, like, it is possible Carla didn't know about his crimes because it's not like she was with him.
Yeah, he had his downtime.
Yeah, his terrible, creepy downtime. And so while they were dating, their relationship was becoming very, very toxic, increasingly over time, because it started off with Paul basically being like perfect Prince Charming, showering Carla with gifts, calling her his princess. And then,
gross.
Yeah, so gross. And then very, very, very quickly, Paul started to become significantly more and more abusive over time, from being like emotionally manipulative, insulting her, and then starting to like dictate what she wore, who she saw, what she did, just always insulting her and making her insult herself, and as well being
typical abusive,
like every level, physically, sexually violent, just really shitty. And I think that's a really important part of this case that a lot of people don't talk about. Like, a lot of people kind of present this case as a situation where Paul and Carla were both equal partners. And I think based on the information that I've read, it's very, very safe to say that there was a power imbalance, and Paul was like abusing the shit out of Carla, essentially. Yeah. Like, she clearly was not on an equal footing with him, at least in the relationship.
And there's a whole like age difference too, which is like very typical.
Yeah, he was older.
Abusive.
Yeah. So despite all this going on, the whole time, Carla continued to, at least outwardly, hold on to the fantasy of the perfect guy that Paul pretended to be at first, especially towards like her family and friends. And she was planning for their wedding, which was going to be June 1991. So denial, sounds like.
Yep.
Very powerful thing.
It's that typical, like, she just, like, wants to have a wedding, and it's, like, some people are so obsessed with, like, their weddings.
I think like, so.
That's just, like, a huge thing, and, like, getting married.
Yeah, the image. And for Paul, too, the image thing was big for him, and also, like, he had convinced her not to go to university, so he was basically, like, the only thing kind of that she had.
Very typical, cutting her off from everything.
Yeah. And his father before him, Paul's dad, was really abusive, and his grandfather was really abusive, so big cycle there. Yeah. But so, despite Carla acting like everything's perfect and how they're going to have this great, lavish, fancy wedding, Paul had started to become obsessed with Carla's younger sister, Tammy.
Oh, yeah. It's so,
like, gross. Repulsive on a lot of levels. But
how old is she again?
She was 15 and Paul was 25. So it's just, like,
10
disgusting.
Years.
Yeah.
And she's a minor.
Yeah. And Carla, I believe, was around 20 at this point. So, yeah. So by early June of 1990, the police were actively looking for the Scarborough rapist, which was Paul, and several people had actually recognized him as being the suspect from a composite photo that had been made public. So in November of 1990, he voluntarily went in for questioning when he was called, and essentially he just charmed the police into thinking he was this really nice, polite guy.
How do they all do that?
I know. Just like, if you act polite, you can't be a murderer. You can't be a rapist, I mean. So basically charmed them into thinking he was this great guy, and he did voluntarily give his DNA, which is good for the police. But at that time, the DNA testing process was very, very slow. And Paul himself, like, his DNA was very low on a list of over 100 samples at that point, with more to be taken,
right,
that still had to be processed.
And they had collected DNA from a lot of the victims.
They had collected DNA from the victims, and they had, like, at one point, they had 200, I remember from a bunch of sources I read, at one point they had 224 suspect samples.
Yeah.
So it's a ton of samples, and the processing was really, really, really slow at the time. So November 1990, they had his DNA, but you'll see it's quite a while before it actually gets, like, tested. Yeah. So November 1990, questioned, gave DNA, and at that point, Paul decided he should get the fuck out of Scarborough and move in with Carla and her family in St. Catharines. So that's where we left off last time. But before I get into today's stuff, I wanted to mention, like, a couple of the other pieces of information I found, just because I thought it was interesting. And these are all things to take with a grain of salt, because some of them I did read from multiple sources, but a lot of them were from, like, true crime blogs, Reddit, and things where I had trouble tracking the source really. Yeah. But one thing I kind of thought was interesting was initially in our last episode, I had mentioned one girlfriend of Paul's previous to Carla and how he was like abusing her and humiliating her.
Yeah, the really young one.
Really young and just like, super imbalance of power. And from what I read later, he actually had several girlfriends. And actually in 1986, which is the year before Paul and Carla met, 2 women had been granted restraining orders against him, which I think is interesting because if you're bad enough that someone needs to grant or whatever, ask for a restraining order against you, that's pretty fucking serious.
And it's granted.
It was granted. And apparently his thing with all his ex-girlfriends was threatening to kill them if they told anyone about him abusing them. And I just think it's really interesting because to me, it sheds more light on what it's like to be in a relationship with Paul and kind of like the way that somebody can trap you by being like, I will kill you if you tell anyone about this. And,
And like, they're so scary that you believe it.
Of course.
Because I'm sure a lot of people could say like, I'm going to kill you. And you're like, okay, no, you're not.
Yeah,
but like,
he's scary.
You scared them so much that they literally believed you.
Right. And I believe many of them were younger than him as well. And I think that can play a role.
Huge.
So had
especially
to say that.
If it's like, okay, it's like a 30-year-old and a 40-year-old, it's like one thing. But when it's like she's like 16 and you're 25 or whatever, like that's huge.
It is. It really is. And obviously Paul is like very well versed in abuse and manipulation. Like these people, these like psychopathic people. Yeah. Well,
for that to be his normal personality.
Exactly. And he specifically has been practicing it a lot. So sadly, he's good at it.
Oy.
But yeah, that's a little extra note on Paul. And then this is like the most frustrating piece, Carla's childhood. I feel like it's like the most enigmatic piece of this case. And so several blogs and like true crime Wikipedia-esque pages, not the actual Wikipedia, but like fandom.com, one of those. Several of them were talking about how Carla's dad was an alcoholic and how he was this known creep in the neighborhood and all this stuff. And saying that basically like he had this mistress and his wife found out. And so his wife said, like Carla's mom, Dorothy, apparently said, okay, mistress, if you have sex with both of us, that will save our marriage. And they like had a threesome. I don't know if this is true. It was a lot from blogs. It was weird. It was a lot from wikis. And like there was this one article, was Karla Homolka's childhood normal? The answer is a resounding no. And it's saying all these kind of claims. So,
but I mean, like,
I don't know.
That's kind of weird, but it's not like so out of this world or like anything that I would be like a lot of people's dads are alcoholics and a lot of people's parents have like marital issues and have infidelity and like do weird sex shit. Like,
yes, it's not on the level of Paul's abusive childhood.
No,
but
not even close.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, not even close. I think there's levels to how much that could affect the events of this case.
Well, and it's like little things can affect somebody hugely depending on who they are.
Right.
But it's like Paul's background is more like, okay, like obviously. You had no chance to be a normal person.
Yeah.
Whereas that it's like, all right, a lot of people have weird parents. Like they're just weird.
And I think at the very least we can say if her dad was truly an alcoholic, even if he wasn't like violent or anything like that, it could be possible that he was maybe emotionally unavailable, because I feel like people who struggle with alcoholism, it's something where they're trying to escape reality. So maybe he wasn't able to be present with Carla, and maybe that is why she was drawn to an emotionally unavailable man in Paul.
Yeah, it makes sense as to why she's drawn to that type of guy. And
I think
like
that's
he turns out to be like insane.
Yeah, except he's just so much worse than you could ever imagine.
There's a lot of like shitty guys who will just be shitty to you. But not a lot of them are like rapists.
Yeah, this is next level. And like violent rapes. Like I did not describe the details of the rapes, but it was very violent.
Yeah.
So now that we're all caught up, I want to pick things up in St. Catharines, Ontario, late November of 1990. So like I said, Paul was obsessed with Tammy. He had been spying on her outside her window as she changed. He had been
it's like creeping on her. Relationship ender. Like if I'm dating some guy who's obsessed with my minor sister, I'd be like, okay, like go don't, but like get.
It's so bad, and I can tell that Paul really used it to gain more power over Carla, because he'd be like, oh, Carla, Tammy's way better than you. In videos that he made of Tammy, because he'd film her like playing soccer, he'd be like, you're so athletic, not like that clumsy Carla. Like he's just using Tammy to demean Carla. But I think I don't know if Karla was just like felt trapped and went along with it. We'll talk about that. But she had kind of, she didn't end it. It wasn't a deal breaker, apparently. And at some point, Karla actually gave her permission for Paul to rape Tammy. She agreed, which is unbelievably insane. And that right there is just like...
Your little sister.
Yeah. Like this part, everything that happens with Tammy, to me, is just like the most fucked up part of this case. Like, obviously,
for sure.
Yeah, it's just like unfathomable to me. Like, I just cannot comprehend how that happened. So in Lethal Marriage, it says that Karla agreed for Paul to rape Tammy, or like whatever. I'm going to use the word rape because that's what it is. It said she had agreed in early December, but other sources give a variety of potential timelines. That's one of the things that I found very conflicting, was the timelines in a lot of different sources. So everything I say was like to the best of my ability. But so some sources said that as early as the summer of 1990, Karla had agreed, which, if you'll recall, Paul had experimented with drugging Tammy at that point. So he had been putting Valium in her and her friends' drinks, and then they found white powder and stopped drinking it. But
and he would like go into her room at night and shit.
He would go into her room at night, and like masturbate on her pillow while she was asleep. And gross. So disgusting. But so apparently another source I read said that Paul actually had given Tammy Valium and she passed out, and he had like started to rape her, but then she woke up or something. Like, I don't know. There was all these different sources, but as far as we know, he had just tried to drug her and like it didn't really work out. But so December of 1990, Karla has agreed to the plan of sedating and raping Tammy. Like, this is unfucking believable. So she ordered the sleeping sedative Halcyon from a pharmacy, saying that it was for the vet clinic that she worked at.
She worked at a vet clinic.
She worked at a vet clinic. And
so she's like, not even just giving her permission, she's like, involved.
Let me get the fucking drugs so you can knock my sister out. Like, that to me is, I mean, it sounds like, Karla, you were really like complicit in this crime.
Absolutely.
Like, did Paul have a gun to your head saying, yeah. So apparently, because Paul wanted backup to make sure that Tammy stayed passed out, Karla also stole something called halothane. Might be saying that wrong. I think that's right. It's an ether-like substance. So she stole that.
What's ether?
Ether like knocks you out.
Oh.
But halothane's way stronger. So she stole that from the vet clinic as well to have like 2 sedatives for Tammy. Like, are you fucking kidding me? So this is about to be a really bad part of this case. So just warning.
Buckle up.
Yeah. So December 23rd, 1990, Paul decided this was going to be the night that he got to have sex with Tammy.
Oh, so close to Christmas too.
That's
so rude.
Yeah. Actually, that's my dog's birthday. So just to make this about me. Okay, so side note, just to mention this like repulsive thing. Apparently at some point, I'm not exactly sure when, but they referred to this as Karla giving Paul Tammy's virginity for Christmas, which is disgusting. Like, you two are bad people. Like, you guys are really awful.
Horrific.
Yeah. And, you know, the big question in this case, I would say, is what was the nature of Karla's involvement? And obviously we'll get into a lot of that, but it's already looking like she's pretty fucking involved.
In there.
Yeah. Like, the normal response, I would think, would be, that's my sister, I must protect her.
Absolutely.
Not like, let me hand her over on a platter.
Ugh.
So that,
and I think her first response was not that. Her first response was jealousy.
Right. She did at first say like, no, Paul, I don't want you to do that. But it was, a jealous situation.
Because she was jealous.
And I think Paul knew her, and these psychopaths, they know how to manipulate women. So I'm sure he played exactly on Karla's insecurities to pit her against Tammy and make it seem like she had to win him over Tammy. Like, I'm sure Paul fucking played her like a fiddle.
Yeah.
But still, no matter how much manipulation, it's still like there's a level of just like morality that,
yeah, it's your little sibling, like your little sister, like you're supposed to protect them. That's your job.
Yeah. So that morning, Paul asked Tammy if she wanted to stay up late and watch a movie with him and Karla, which she agreed to, because apparently she felt like it was really cool that these older, like her sister and her cool older boyfriend wanted to hang out with her, which is so sad.
She's a 15-year-old baby.
Yeah. Of course she thinks it's cool to hang out with them. And they're fucking predators. So In the afternoon, Paul crushed up the Halcyon sleeping pills, and some sources say that Karla helped. Some say she didn't help with that part, but she stole the drugs in the first place, so, I mean...
She's in it.
Yeah, she's in it. So the Homolka family and Paul were hanging out around the home in the evening. So just as a reminder, there was Karla's mom, Dorothy, her dad, Carol, her younger sister, Lori, who's the middle sister, and the youngest sister, Tammy, who is 15. So Paul was going around filming everyone with his video camera, which is like his thing that he loved doing. And apparently the parents were really annoyed by it and just being like, Paul, get out of our face. But the three sisters were all playing along and like kind of hamming it up for the camera. Tammy's parents had allowed her to have a couple drinks that night, so she was having some rum with eggnog.
Oh, right. It's Christmas time.
It's Christmas time, yeah. And in Lethal Marriage, it said that she was noticeably groggy and was weaving as she sat on the couch with her drink.
So she had already been drugged?
Because, of course, yes, her drink had been spiked with Halcyon. So after the rest of the family went to sleep, Paul, Karla, and Tammy were hanging out together in the basement recreation room. Paul put on a movie called Lisa, which is about a serial killer woman who murders her dates, because fucking obviously. Paul loved, like, American Psycho, like, any type of, you know.
He wanted to be.
Yeah, he wanted to be Patrick Bateman, is that his name? Yeah, he wanted to be him, which is, you achieved that, sir. Yeah, so Tammy had been sipping a glass of orange juice at that point, which Paul had put more Halcyon in because he was feeling impatient. So shortly after the movie started, Tammy put her glass down and just passed out on the couch. After making sure that Tammy wasn't waking up, Paul and Karla moved her onto the floor next to the Christmas tree. Karla went into her room and got the brown flask of halothane, poured some on a cloth, and just held it over her sister's mouth. Then Paul turned on his trusty camcorder and put it on the floor beside him and started recording. So
why do they always record the evidence?
Yeah, I know that it's recording the evidence, but Paul had like a fetish for pornography and he had a fetish for like rape porn and homemade like abuse porn. So for him, it was like, I think part of it was having the tape to watch later for more sexual gratification.
And like you'd have to think that it's got to be part of it because otherwise
it's part
like,
of it. Yeah.
Dude.
You're literally just filming the evidence. Like, yeah. And he's a fucking narcissist. You know what I mean?
He
doesn't care. He doesn't have remorse.
Especially when you've
like,
gotten away with so many rapes already. You're like, oh, I'm untouchable.
Right. Yeah. And he kind of, I think, knows, which we'll get into later. I think he knows, like, he's got Karla, like, he can blackmail Karla with that, too. So it's like, you know. So the camera's filming, and Lethal Marriage, the book that I read, has transcripts of what happened. So there's a couple of different books actually that have the transcripts. Lethal Marriage has it written out as if it were like a novel. Like it's not like Karla, blah, blah, blah. It's Karla reluctantly climbed. Like it's like describing it. So the descriptor words that I'm going to say are adapted from like this author's adaptation. Because the actual video footage was never shown to the public,
it's
obviously.
Just a transcript.
Yeah, out of respect for the victims, although the tapes were later played at the trials. But the transcripts were released. And side note, in Lethal Marriage, he says, I put the transcripts in here not to like exploit the victims, but because it shows Karla's involvement and people need to know.
Yeah, well, that's what the whole thing is
That's
about.
like the whole thing, basically. So in the book, it said that Karla was asking Paul to hurry up because she was worried that someone upstairs might come down and catch them, which is like, really, bro? You're telling him to hurry up because you're worried that? Not because, like, you know? Anyway, so apparently Paul just told her, shut up, keep Tammy down. So Karla poured more halothane on the cloth and pressed it again on her sister's face. Yes, and let me take this time to actually tell you a little bit about halothane. So it's twice as strong as chloroform and 4 times as strong as ether. So it's an extremely potent sedative. And in operating rooms, it's not put on someone's face or ingested. It's administered by vaporizer, which means that you need small amounts of it to have a huge effect.
And she's just pouring it on.
She's pouring it on her sister's face. And when it's administered in operating rooms, it has to be very closely monitored. Of course. It's a risky substance. So Karla, who you'll recall worked at a vet clinic, knew all this. And yet she was still splashing the liquid all over a cloth and applying it directly to her sister's face while Paul raped her. So, and Karla definitely had to know that halothane can cause nausea and vomiting, as well that the Halcyon sleeping pills came with a huge fucking warning on the side that said overuse can be fatal, as well as do not like a huge warning on the bottle that said, do not take these pills with alcohol. But for some reason, which we may never know, Karla didn't really seem to show any concern about drugging her sister with these substances after giving her alcohol.
So I'm sure a lot of people speculate that she meant to kill her.
A lot of people do, especially on good old Reddit.
Which, I mean, I think is a very interesting theory, and I don't pretend to know, but like, I think if she's really jealous of Tammy and she's allowing this, it wouldn't be crazy to think that she wanted to kill her, because she's like,
get her out of the way.
I'll give Paul what he wants, and then she'll be gone, so he can't be compared. Because like, if in her mind she's jealous of his adoration for Tammy, and if she's gone, then she doesn't have to worry about that anymore. Right? And she's like a fucking psychopath, so she doesn't care.
I think a lot of people believe that, and I genuinely don't know. But
no, you could never know.
We can't know her motives, especially at that point and like heat of the moment. But at the very least, it's incredibly negligent to be drugging her in this way.
Of course.
Like it's
it's already, it is what it is already, but like you know what you're doing.
Yeah. It's insane. Like it's one thing to be like, okay, let's knock her out and then like do this thing, but it's like you're knocking her out with substances that shouldn't be mixed with alcohol, and you're excessively overusing the substances that could be fatal.
And that say it very clearly in the bottle.
Yeah. So
that you must work with in the vet clinic.
Yeah. So that part to me is really
that's like, very indicative of a motive of possibly wanting to kill her. Yeah.
So super disgusting part. Paul started telling Karla to join in on raping Tammy with him. And in Lethal Marriage, it describes Karla protesting and sobbing and not wanting to at first, but then she agreed and started to join in on assaulting her sister with Paul. So it said she was like really, really reluctant to do it, which I don't know if that means anything, but to me it kind of does, especially with what comes later. To me, it does say something that at the very least she didn't want to get involved in raping her sister, which nobody should.
Also, like, it's like it's like incestual. Like,
it's gross.
Fucking nasty.
Yeah, it's gross. It's disgusting. I mean, I think she was essentially basically like, if Paul, like, if I don't do what Paul says, he's gonna fucking lose it on me, so I just have to listen to him and just get it over with. But it's just like, really, like, this is all just terrible.
Yeah, it's
so
really disturbing.
Yeah. So Karla allegedly reluctantly assaults her sister, and then Paul gave her the camera to hold, and he raped Tammy again. So while this is all filming, he suddenly stops, and then around this point is when Karla actually turned the camera off. But as far as we know, based on the book, apparently Paul said, I think there's something wrong. When they looked at Tammy, she was blue. Her neck had been angled to the side while Paul was raping her, which had probably blocked her air passage, and she had vomited and seemed to have choked on her own vomit. After that, Tammy never woke up again. So, after being like, oh fuck, she might be dead, Paul and Karla decided, let's clean up the evidence. They dressed Tammy up and then moved her into a bedroom that was right next to the rec room, so in the basement. Then they called 911 because, okay, you guys are calling for help, I guess. And the story they gave the police was that, like, when a whole emergency crew arrived, which included police, and the story they gave them was, we were watching a movie, we were all hanging out together in the basement rec room, and while we were watching the movie, Tammy was saying, oh, my vision's blurry, and they thought, oh, she probably is just feeling dizzy because she had some drinks, she doesn't have an alcohol tolerance, it's not a big deal. So they claimed that they fell asleep in each other's arms partway through the movie, which go fuck yourselves, you guys. Yeah. You are not a wholesome couple.
And, like, no one asked.
Yeah, I know. It's so extra, so performative. So
they're such losers.
Yeah, they're the worst. So they had fallen asleep in each other's arms, apparently, and then they woke up because they heard Tammy choking and coughing. So at that point, Paul claimed he jumped up, what's wrong with poor Tammy? Love her so much, and tried to revive her, like with mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, but it didn't work. So at that point,
which explains like his DNA all over her.
Sure. At that point,
not inside her, but
yeah, at least that's true. I didn't actually think about that, but yeah, so didn't work. They called for help, and the police were like, "That's suspicious, you guys, because why were you in the? Why was Tammy found in the bedroom when you guys said you guys were in the rec room when this happened? So." why was she moved to the bedroom if you were just trying to give her mouth to mouth?
Yeah, why would they do that?
And this is the weirdest thing to the police, was she had this red mark all over her face. And it was assumed to be like what we assume is a chemical burn from the halothane. But the police were like, what the fuck is that? Like, how did that happen? So Tammy was taken to the hospital, but they failed to revive her.
Yeah.
And one policeman was still at the Homoko house. So the hospital called and said, hey, like, Tammy passed away. So he had to break the news to the family. And guess who was, which is gotta be the hardest and worst call to make, obviously. And then guess who had the most upset reaction to hearing the news?
It was Carla.
No, it was Paul. Paul was super upset. He was like, no, like yelling, freaking out. Apparently he was like slamming his head against the wall and being so like extremely upset. Like, bro.
What a piece of human trash.
And the annoying thing too is like he loved Tammy so much. So it's like,
he didn't love Tammy.
No, not at
all.
all.
Nobody in their right mind would think that he loved Tammy.
Yeah, but he probably thought he did.
This man is not capable of loving anything.
That's for sure. So entitled and just like, go fuck yourself. So Carla and her sister Lori, who had woken up, were like hugging each other and just softly crying. So I'm sure Carla was like, whether or not she intended to carry out a murder of Tammy or simply be an accomplice to rape, I'm sure some part of her was shocked and upset to actually experience the death of her sister.
I'm sure that, because especially when you're young, when she's like 20 years old, like
20,
you just don't think about consequences. And like when you were telling me the story, like I'm thinking, like I'm putting myself in her shoes and being like, look, I got into this, I kind of got in over my head with Paul and blah, 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 and like I did this, and then it's like once you see that like you've literally killed her, it's just like the panic must sink in.
Yeah.
And
like the shock.
But I think that the first thing she thought about is herself. How do I get out of this? What are the consequences for me? I don't think that her first thought was, oh my God, my poor sister.
Which is just...
And that's my own, like, purely my own speculation, but...
A lot of people agree with you, and I just think, like, Carla is such a fucking enigma that we'll probably never know.
Yeah,
but it's just hard. So, like, the psychological boxes, like, it does not click for me. Whereas with Paul, it's like textbook, you're a narcissist, whatever. Yeah. But here it's like, what? What's happening there? I don't understand.
Them so much that it's like I just don't. It's hard to like think charitably about them.
Right. I mean, I personally hate Paul more, and I will admit I'm biased as a woman.
Yeah.
So
true.
I'm definitely really
but
biased.
I hate Paul so much that like I hate Carla a lot. But it's just like a little bit less than Paul.
Right.
Like, still a lot.
Because to an extent, Carla, and we'll see more later, to an extent, she is a victim, but that doesn't excuse anything.
But also, I think, and I don't want to get too ahead of the whole thing, but I think
discuss.
Paul is like slightly more like honest about who he is, whereas
that's
she
interesting.
Is not.
Yeah.
And like where she is now, which I won't spoil. Like,
there's so much. There's so much here. So, yeah. So the police were at the house. They asked Paul, like they obviously had to question Paul and Carla because they had been with Tammy. So they're like, we just want to know the facts of the case.
Yeah.
And they said, why was...
How the fuck did they get out of this one?
I know. It's kind of weird how they did, right? So they asked... why was Tammy in the bedroom? And Paul said, well, the lighting was better in there, so we moved her there to see what we were doing when we tried to revive her. And the police later checked, and he said, the lighting seems to be the same in the rec room. And like, this was aside from his conversation. The lighting seems to be the same in the rec room and the bedroom, but the rec room has a dimmer switch. So maybe Paul didn't know how it worked. Like, he was like, okay, that could be legit. Yeah. But they did ask, what's the deal with that mark around Tammy's mouth? And Paul had an answer ready. He said, she must have gotten a rug burn when we were moving her into the bedroom, which is extremely suspicious because the police were like, did you drag her face down? Like, how the fuck did she get a rug burn on her face?
He should have said that he, like, slapped her face to try to wake her up.
That's something. But I have a photo. Like, there is a photo of the burn, and it's, like, it's very suspicious looking.
Yeah.
That was the most suspicious thing to the police.
For sure.
So Paul and Carla were asked to go down to the police station to give a formal statement, but they weren't being viewed as suspects. The police just wanted to understand how Tammy, who is in great health and 15 years old, could suddenly die from just choking on her vomit.
Yeah, and just from having like one.
Yeah, like a couple eggnogs. So.
Yeah, maybe 3, like, max.
Right.
I would have to assume.
Yeah, only a few. So they questioned Paul and Carla, and they did let them go. Paul put on this huge fucking display where he was like, I know my rights. If I'm not being charged for anything, you guys can't hold me here. Tammy was like my sister. I love her. Like, all this bullshit. So they were like, yeah, technically, you do know your rights, bro. We're not holding you for anything, so you can go.
Which, like, innocent people of the world, you should know that, too.
Yeah, know your rights. If you're not being charged with anything, you can leave. But go fuck yourself, Paul.
Yeah.
So the main thing, though, the police were really confused about, like I said, was the mark on Tammy's face. But they figured that, okay, maybe it was an acid burn from the stomach acid in her vomit. Like, that's what they were like, maybe it could be that. Like, they didn't know what it could be.
Because they're not assuming that they, like, drugged the shit out of her and raped her. Like,
yeah, exactly.
Why would you assume that?
I know. Who the fuck would do that? So Tammy's death was listed as suspicious, and they ordered an autopsy, but no charges were being considered at that point.
Right.
So a few days later, Tammy's funeral was held, and Paul and Carla both left notes in her casket, which were a whole bunch of bullshit, and just like, oh, Tammy, we love you so much, XOXO.
I'm rolling my eyes really hard for those.
Yeah, and then they also left a photo in her casket, which I'm going to show you, Madison, and we'll put up on the screen for all of our YouTube people. They left a photo in her casket as well, which was this photo. It's a photo of Paul and Carla smiling and waving. And it's a very creepy photo.
That is so creepy,
and
because
they
it's
put
like
that in her fucking casket.
That looks like they're like, haha.
Yeah, they're like, hey, girl.
Fucking gotcha.
Yeah, it's really creepy.
What?
So they left that in there.
Why that? Like, what do they have to say about that? Like, what the fuck is that?
Just like, hey, Tammy, we love you. We're narcissists. Like, I don't know.
That's the creepiest.
Yeah, it's kind of like the opposite of a serial killer taking a trophy. It's like them leaving their like
mark
gloating.
on it.
Yeah, and the letters.
Yeah, it looks like they're gloating.
It looks like that.
And
yeah.
It's like,
really?
And
yeah.
I guess, okay, so picture like you're the parents and you see this and you don't obviously think that they're this complete psychopaths.
Why
that they
would
are.
you?
You're like, oh, they're like, they loved her. You know, yeah, I
Yeah.
can see how like you could take that innocently. But my God, knowing.
It's a creepy photo. Everyone check us out on YouTube and watch and listen to this part and watch the photo, because it's just like, what the fuck is that? So
you just like don't need to do that.
Yeah, I know. So everything in this case, like this, you just did not need to do that. So not laughing because it's funny, laughing because it's insane. So over the next few weeks, the family was grieving, and Paul played along and played the role of a supportive, sad family member. At this point, he and Carla both mostly stayed in the house. They skipped meals, they lost weight, acted depressed. And so, although it looked like they were grieving Tammy's death on the outside, obviously they were really concerned that the police were going to find evidence of Tammy being drugged and raped during the autopsy they were doing.
Yeah, shitting themselves.
Yeah, of course.
And it's like...
And also, you guys are idiots.
Was there any sort of, like, police, like, putting Paul's name into a database and being like, oh, he's a suspect as a Scarborough rapist? Like,
no, because this was in St. Catharines, which is a different jurisdiction. So at that point, and I'll talk about this later, we didn't have like the FBI Central Intelligence. So Scarborough's part of the Toronto Metro Police. St. Catharines is part of the Niagara Regional Police. So they didn't have back and forth.
Like how, but I just don't understand how like all of Canada can't just have like one database.
I think maybe they do now, but in the 90s they didn't. Early 90s, late 80s they didn't. So it's like, insane. How fucking shitty is that?
Because like that would have been a major red flag.
Yeah. So while they're like grieving, quote unquote, Paul was actually extra concerned that Carla was going to crack under pressure and admit their guilt, because...
Yeah, she's probably shitting herself that like they're going to figure it out, and he's shitting himself that she's gonna. Yeah. And so how did he deal with this? He just amped up his abusive behavior. Just way up. He was regularly telling her that he's going to kill her and her family if she said anything. And of course, he had the video evidence that was implicating her as well. But a couple days into the new year, the autopsy results came back, and the cause of death was listed as aspiration, which is fluid in the lungs. Officially, it had been decided that Tammy had vomited while she was passed out,
choked on the vomit, and died from that.
So how do they not find drugs in her system?
I know they didn't anything.
Check for them.
I guess they must have not checked.
I think with a lot of drugs, like you have to look for them in order to find them.
It could be that, or maybe it's, I don't know if it's something that like only shows up on certain tests that they didn't run. Like, I don't know. I guess they weren't looking for drugs, but maybe they should have been.
I just don't understand, like, do you not just like test the blood and like see what comes
so
back? I guess like with all this shit,
that.
like these like tests cost money, so it's like you need some sort of reason to run those tests, otherwise they don't do it. Because like if you're testing everybody for everything, then that's just endless resources, which sucks. Like it would be great if like I guess
it wouldn't be efficient to do it that way, but at the same time, like that's how you probably would find this stuff.
Yeah,
because imagine they found the drugs in her system. That's already like, okay, so this is like intentional in some way.
Yeah, and then it's like, obviously you guys did it.
And this is really like fucked up, and I don't understand how this happened. Paul had raped Tammy twice, both vaginally and anally, but nothing about that had been noted, or about the pills in her system.
Well, yeah, again, no reason to test.
They weren't looking.
They didn't do a rape kit.
I have a autopsy photo. Would you like to see it?
Yes, but my God, yeah, I already see it.
So that a huge burn on our face.
That is
I don't know if
clear chemical burn.
We can.
I don't think we should post that, but like
it's out there. You can just Google it.
If you really want to see it, you can find it.
Yeah. So it's like this massive burn on her face. Which, how was that not looked into?
Yeah,
like
that alone is like extremely suspicious.
Yeah.
Vomit does not make a mark like that.
Yeah,
you could sit and vomit for hours and it would not make a mark like that.
I know. It doesn't make any sense. But at this point, the Niagara Police Department officially decided that Tammy's death was an accident. So, case closed.
That's insane.
Yep. So, after that, life in the Homolka household went back to mostly normal, or at least seemingly normal. Carla was back working at the vet clinic. Paul was, at that point, collecting unemployment and smuggling cigarettes. He was no longer an accountant. The Homolka parents had gone back to work. But the Homolka family was starting to have issues with Paul. They had noticed that he was...
Gee,
yeah,
why?
fucking finally, bro. It took long enough.
God.
I guess he had only moved in end of November. Before that, he was just showing up a couple times a week with like gifts and being super fake. But they had noticed that Paul was always hovering around Carla, especially when she tried to talk to someone in the family, as well as he started like blatantly and openly ordering her around like a servant. So they were like, dude,
could you not do that?
Yeah, like, why are you doing this in our house? And you're just being, like, super overbearing and, rude. So that was happening. Meanwhile, one night while the rest of the family was out, Paul decided to have Carla, once again, dress up as Tammy and roleplay her during sex. And he taped this little encounter, and it is transcribed in Lethal Marriage, but I will spare you the description of that.
Oh my God.
He basically had her pretend to be Tammy and just say a bunch of shit that he would want Tammy to say, I guess, and it's just all, like...
foul.
Incomprehensible. So another night, he played back the tape they made of them raping Tammy, and then got mad at Carla for ruining the tape by saying she didn't want to join in on raping Tammy, and then beat her in a rage, although he was always careful not to hit her on the face because her family would see bruises. So good intentional psychopathy there. So that's Paul and Carla's first crime together, and the first death that we know of that they were responsible for together. I think, like, obviously, as we've said before, the most controversial aspect of this, like, Tammy's death is the nature of Carla's involvement, because I would say it seems like Paul never had any intention for Tammy to die. I would assume that he would want to, like, it doesn't seem like he had any interest in Tammy dying. Totally my opinion based on the research.
Yeah, I think that, like, my thoughts on that are, like, I think he liked using Tammy to get to Carla.
For sure.
If anything, he wouldn't want her dead because he would want to keep doing that.
Right. And for his sexual gratification.
And it also doesn't seem, and I'll wait till the rest of the crimes to see what the case is, but it doesn't seem like he's like got any sort of fetish for like actually killing people.
Right. His MO is raping.
Like he likes the rape and the power and the control, and even like keeping them alive means like he still has that like psychological hold on them.
Totally.
So I don't buy that he wanted her to die, and in any case, like, that her dying just caused more problems for him.
Right.
Whereas for Carla, her dying gets rid of problems.
Right. And the thing is with Paul, like, I think that's very interesting about his psychology. He like he enjoyed the power that he had of the threat over women, and then like literally like the violent rape and the abuse. But he wasn't one of those psychopaths that wanted to like snuff out a life, at least at this point. At least
it seems with him it would be more like if you killed somebody, it would be to get rid of evidence, not
because of the act of killing.
We're sexually into the killing.
So debatable though whether Carla ever had intention for Tammy to die.
I kind of think
it's very debatable. I
lean more towards that.
Yeah, I think it's very possible. Reddit, like there's a lot of people who are like this was Carla's intention. Like people are really on that train, and that was the first time that I had ever heard that, because I had like obviously read all this stuff, but I guess I hadn't really taken in how either negligent or intentionally murderous the drugs that Carla was giving her sister were. So I was kind of like believing that, yeah, it was an accident, and hearing the takes of people that are like, hey, she wanted to get Tammy out of the way for Paul.
Yeah.
She's plausible.
Can you imagine if you're like a regular person in a relationship and like your boyfriend is saying that he like likes another woman, not even like your sister? How horrible would that be?
Yeah.
And if you're like if you're gonna sit through that and justify his behavior and like allow it to happen, like you're clearly not blaming the guy. So the next thing you're gonna do is try to get rid of
building up resentment towards Tammy.
Exactly.
So, and I will talk more about my interpretation of Carla's psychology, but I agree that she was misdirecting her anger in the wrong place.
Yeah, it's like when a guy cheats on a girl and then she gets mad at the girl, and it's like, dude.
Yeah.
Who is the problem here?
So true. It's exactly that. So some experts have said that Carla was basically operating in survival mode, and she was so afraid of Paul that she just went along with whatever he wanted, basically saying that like she was suffering from battered women syndrome, where she'd been conditioned by Paul's constant abuse to just do whatever it took to appease him. But others have said that Carla had no conscience about her sister's death, and actually on that note, in 2001, Elm Street magazine published an article suggesting that Carla had intentionally given Tammy an overdose of halothane. This article called Carla a malignant narcissist and said that she was so jealous and angry that Paul was obsessed with her sister that she intentionally murdered her. So, experts on both sides.
Yeah, I lean more towards that, but I'm not a psychiatrist, so what do I know?
Me neither, but I almost think it's a little combination of both. Just
yeah.
I think that like psychological abuse will change a person, or at least will change how a person operates. Like people will do things under conditions of stress that they wouldn't normally do otherwise, like kind of like the Lord of the Flies thing. If you put a bunch of boys on an island and they end up like killing one of them, probably wouldn't have done that in another context. So I think that there's the fact that Paul was such a piece of shit to Carla. I'm sure that affected her.
For sure.
And like if she had a nice guy.
No, absolutely. But it's also like, a lot of people who, I don't know.
A lot of people have been abused and they don't do that shit. So.
No, and also like she like maybe this is shitty to say because I haven't been there and I don't know, but like she's living in her family home.
Right.
Like she's not isolated off somewhere
but
where she has nowhere to run.
Isolated, I think.
She definitely psychologically isolated for sure, and like definitely. But I think it's also part of her narcissism of her thinking like, I'm nothing without Paul. Like you have to kind of.
Yeah, like she tied her identity to Paul. But that's what narcissists do, is make you feel that way. Like they make you feel like you're nothing without them.
Yes, but it's like she liked that picture of being in a marriage and being with this perfect, and he's not, but he's disgusting, perfect guy so much that it's like, do you really feel trapped, or are you so attached to this idea that you're just like single-mindedly only thinking of this? Because I remember like as a 20-year-old, as a 18, 19, 20-year-old, there was a lot of things that I wanted, and it was my shitty self-centeredness that made me want these things and made me like, be shitty to other people and like give up on other things. And it's not because like my boyfriend at the time was making me do this or that. It was because I selfishly wanted something.
Yeah.
So I think that that's like part of it. I don't think that it's 100% like, all Paul's fault that she turned out like this. I think part of her, and this is pure speculation, of course, again, but part of her is like, I want that dream wedding. I want that dream life with this like amazing guy. Yeah. And it's like, that's your own selfishness.
I think that's for sure. And probably like denial is a huge piece of it, where she was like just clinging to this unrealistic hope because she just didn't have anything else.
Yeah, and it's like she gave up on school and whatever, which I think he like tried to make her do. Like he did, he like caused that, but it's like, dude, like,
girl, you're 20. Like you've got plenty of time to pivot. So that's all going down. January 12th, 1991, and I read conflicting accounts on what happened here, but either just Paul or both Karla and Paul lured a 16-year-old girl over to the Homolka's house when everyone was out, and Paul just rapes her and then drives her back home. Or has sex with her somewhat consensually. I'm not sure.
Which is crazy because like she's seeing his face, I'm assuming.
Yeah. I think he just kind of brought her over. Brazen. He's bold, yeah. I'm not 100% clear on the details of this, but all I know is that this happened because I read from multiple different sources that this happened, and Paul later specifically confessed to this rape. So I guess it was a rape. In Lethal Marriage, it was kind of like Paul told Karla, hey, I'm bringing a girl over. If you see her, pretend you're my friend, whatever. And then he like went and hooked up with her and then told Karla like, oh, I just like fucked this girl. And Karla was like, you deserve it. You're great. Like she just was like, I don't fucking care. Like whatever. But
I'm sure to her at this point, it's just like sometimes him being with other women is probably just like a relief.
Yes. And that happens in multiple instances later in this case. But so I don't really know 100% the details because of the different conflicting accounts, but Paul specifically confessed to this as a rape and referred to this victim as January Girl. So that is a Paul with a potential Karla accomplice rape, or at least Karla aware.
Yeah.
As far as we know, that's the first rape she was aware of because he allegedly didn't tell her that he was a Scarborough rapist.
Right.
So it's now the end of January 1991. And the Homolkas essentially wanted Paul to get the fuck out of their house. They were just sick of having him there, hovering around, being a dick to Karla. So they finally told Karla, he needs to move out, and we need time alone with the family. Which Karla was super upset because she knew Paul's going to be pissed, and she's going to have to tell him, and he's going to take it out on her. So that's what happened.
I'm so curious as to like the family chat, like, does her mom like talk to her about him?
That's what I'm interested in. I don't feel that they did. And I think that's where the psychological isolation piece comes in because, and I know for myself when I was late teens, early 20s, I was very distant from my parents and I would have had a hard time confessing something like this to them. Obviously not the Tammy, that's like way beyond, but even just like the Paul abuse, I wouldn't have been able to. And I think it's interesting because maybe there was that degree of emotional unavailability from the parents, even though they were in the same house and had
just like a family with a culture of like not talking about their problems.
Exactly. Sweep it under the rug type of thing.
Yeah.
So apparently Paul was like to Karla, that earned you 5, which is his saying for like, I'm going to hate you 5 times for saying that he has to move out. Like you're trash. So he was really mad at her, but the truth was he was really mad that if I'm not here, is Karla gonna fucking tell them what we did to Tammy? Like that's genuinely what he was pissed about.
I was worried.
So after only 2 days of being back at his parents' place in Scarborough, which I'm sure was a nightmare of 2 days being back with his parents.
Yeah.
So right away, 2 days later, he called Karla and told her he wanted her to move out with him. So he found a house in an area of St. Catharines called Port Dalhousie and was accepted as a renter by the homeowners. We will put up a nice photo of the house and I will show Madison. Nice little house right here.
Cute little house.
It's super cute little house. So he was accepted as a renter by the homeowners and they were ready to move in on February 1st. So very, very quickly.
Great. Now they have their own place.
They've got their own fucking place. So, and then at that point, Paul had given 6 months of post-dated checks to pay for rent. So it was like, we're here, we're settled. Although his only income was from smuggling cigarettes at that point. So
cigarettes.
So I guess his unemployment had run out. And he didn't really have the money to spend on the rent, as well as the furniture and like all this other flashy bullshit he was buying.
And she's not working. So
she's at the vet clinic.
Right. She's at the vet clinic.
But like $8.25 an hour, I'm pretty sure it was. So.
But also rent was what, like $2 a month?
I think it was like $1,000, which is still, $2 a month. Yeah, it's like, 50 cents.
Compared to now.
Yeah. So they didn't really have this money, but they were able to use Karla's credit card. So they were like, we're buying all this fancy ass furniture, whatever.
That's never a good idea.
Yeah. I mean, there's many bad ideas and
yeah, true.
So
of all the bad ideas,
the credit cards.
Maybe not the worst.
So Paul decided that the spare room. I just had to include this. It's like not necessary for the case, but like I fucking had to include this. So he decided that the spare room on the second floor was going to be his rap studio, and that's where he was
still rapping at this point.
Yeah, he's going to be a rapper. You didn't know?
Oh, I knew that
you didn't know about Paul Bernardo's illustrious rap career. Yeah, so he had this fucking studio, and that's where he was going to work on an album, which he told Carla, I'm going to become rich and famous as a rapper. Like, the delusion.
Scarbo rapist.
Yeah, he really was. So, yeah, so that just felt necessary to add.
If anybody here watches Trailer Park Boys, he is the psychopathic version of J-Rock for sure.
For sure. I don't know that
I know, but it's
yeah,
true.
For sure. Let us know if you know that reference. Okay, so this is pretty sad, but in Lethal Marriage, basically, not surprising, but basically Paul, once he had Carla isolated living with him, he became significantly even more abusive. And if you'll recall, he was already very fucking abusive towards her.
He was already horrendous.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm sure out of the eyes of her family.
Right. And in his home, like in their home.
Like, that's also, now you're adding physical isolation too.
Right. So next level abuse. And so Paul would frequently blame her for Tammy's death, which debatably is fair. Like, it might have been her fault.
But it's a smart thing to put in her head because then she's not going to tell anyone.
Right. Master of manipulation. That's fucking for sure. So he would have like these seemingly random and sudden outbursts of anger towards Carla where he would verbally abuse her, beat her, shove her to the ground, just be awful. And then a second later would be calm and collected, apologize, help her up, watch her while she cleaned her wounds or whatever. So
which is so classic.
Yeah, very classic. Like, oh, sorry you made me hate you, like that kind of shit.
Sorry, I was drunk.
Yeah. So Paul was unemployed, like I said, so he would stay up late, he would get super drunk, he would replay the tape that he made of Tammy, or they made, and like masturbate to the tape and just get off on it.
Disgusting.
Yeah. Meanwhile, Carla had to sleep early because she had to wake up for her job at the vet clinic. However, Paul would wake her up, demand sexual favors, or just wake her up to beat her. And then
wake her up to beat her?
Yeah, because he was just drunk and angry in the middle of the night. So he'd wake her up. And apparently he would call it like the nightly terrorist attack and be like, I'll wake you up for the nightly terrorist attack. Like, imagine trying to sleep under those conditions.
And then like depriving people of sleep is another form of
That's torture. And he'd be like, Carla, wake up, like, give me oral sex. And Carla would say, no.
Give me oral
I'm trying to make it so.
Say it like that?
Yes. Yes. My, like, functional way of saying it. I don't know what he said. But actually, the book describes it that way, too. It's very like, all right, you guys.
Okay.
It's always like he raped her vaginally. Like, okay.
It's not something to laugh at.
That's what Paul said. But then, like,
Dowdy said it like that.
He said it exactly like that. And then Carla would be like, no, I'm trying to sleep. And then he would like fucking hit her and be like, just do it. And she'd like cry and do it. So I think that's like absolutely horrible. And then he was doing this thing where like they were sharing a queen bed. I believe it was a queen size bed. And he'd be like constantly like being like, Carla, move over. You're in my space. And like nudging her. And then after a while, he like shoved her to the ground. It was like, Carla, sleep on the floor tonight. So she had to sleep on the floor. She like went to grab a blanket and like slept on the floor. So that was kind of like the vibe that was happening there.
And now question.
Sure.
This is not all videotaped. So where is this information coming from? Is this her
probably
recounting
probably
it?
Carla
like,
recounting
is it purely her recounting it?
That's what I think. I think that's kind of, I mean, it must be because Paul's not going to admit to this shit.
Well, right. But that also lends to like,
there's a grain of salt.
Yeah.
I think it's believable. Like, I think a lot of this stuff is believable. Obviously, like, specific events might not be.
I think it's believable, but, like, down the line, she's gonna...
Don't say. We'll say what happens.
No, I won't say what happens, but, like, down the line, she's probably gonna exaggerate the relationship or, like, the bad stuff in order to make herself look better.
Right.
Because she has to paint herself as a victim.
Right. So we don't really know how much of this is true or not. There's some things that we kind of know are true because
I buy that this was the vibe.
Yeah, but we
I
don't know the specifics.
And we don't know if it's like, you know, like a level 5 versus a level 10. We don't, you know, I think that's where It's kind of
But the reason that I brought up the other girlfriends is because it really tracks with how he was treating the other girlfriends.
And I buy that, like, he's a rapist and, like, he's probably sexually abusing her and definitely, like
physically and emotionally.
Yeah, but it's like...
Right. We don't know for sure with the specifics. Here's something that they do have evidence for, though. So Paul was like obsessed with Carla, and this is definitely evidenced in other things too. He was obsessed with Carla, telling her how much she loved him. Like, he just wanted her to say, like, Paul, I love you. Like, you're the best, all this stuff. She'd have to write him notes that said, I love you, Paul, 10 times over. So they like have all these notes. And if apparently, allegedly, if she didn't say she loved him frequently enough, he would use that as an excuse to just like beat up on her. Also, Paul would frequently talk, allegedly, about bringing a young girl home and using her as a sex slave. That was like his thing. He was like, I'm going to abduct a girl and we're going to use her as a sex slave, Carla. And apparently Carla didn't say anything to protest and would even agree when she suggested it, maybe to appease him, but maybe she did get off on the idea too. I don't know.
Yeah, how do you know?
As far as we know, she did not protest.
But that seems to be like a pretty, like, there's been many cases of that where, like, there's a couple and the guy is super abusive and blah blah, and then the guy's like, I'm gonna bring home a sex slave, and it's like almost a relief to the woman.
Yeah, the girl's like, fine, beat up on her, not me.
He's gonna turn all of his abuse to
at
her.
Least some of it. Yeah, absolutely.
That girl who was in the box for 20 years.
Yeah, definitely. So at this point, Carla, in some of her letters to her friends, evidence for this, would continue to say, I'm having a great time with Paul. We love having our own place together. It's such an adventure, like all this stuff. So she was saying all that. And they continued to plan for their wedding that was going to be in June. So this wedding was going to be very, very fancy, expensive.
Who's paying for this wedding?
The parents. So Carla's family wanted them to scale it down because they're like, we just spent so much on Tammy's funeral. Also, she just died. Isn't this in bad taste for you guys to have a huge fucking flashy extra wedding? But apparently Paul was like, I'm not even going to consider that. Like, I'm this like fancy wealthy man and I should be, you know what I mean? Like, he was like cigarettes? Yeah, like he was like, no, a man of my status should be having this fancy wedding. And
a rapper of this level.
Of this caliber. So apparently he was like, I don't know if this is true, but apparently he like told Carla's parents, like, take out a second mortgage on your house to pay for this wedding. Like, we're having this wedding.
Could you imagine if your daughter's fiance, I suppose, I would be like, get the fuck out of here.
Yeah, like he's so entitled. So wedding plans
and they
continue.
Were like, okay.
I think they compromised. Like, I think they were kind of like, you know, we'll do what we can. And then I think at one point Paul had to ask his parents for some of the money. And he was like, Carla, your parents are cheap. Like, they won't pay for the wedding. Yeah.
And like, what did his dad give him?
I don't know. I think maybe he gave him some money. I'm not really sure. So
I can't imagine the father would be that generous.
No, I don't think so. So in mid-March, Paul went on a trip to Florida, which included his friend Val Smirnis, who you might recall was involved in telling the police that he was the Scarborough rapist.
Right.
It was like one of his longtime friends, which, bro, why are you hanging out with Paul? That's a mistake. So on this trip to Florida, Paul hooked up with a woman there, and like they were like, you know, picking up girls and whatever, and he creeped Val out, who like, why are you still friends with Paul?
Yeah, when you've told people that when like you think he's their Scarborough rapist.
Right. I don't know if it was him who had said that or his brother. It was something like that.
Yeah,
but
wasn't it the brother?
It might have been the brother, but they like Val had noticed that like Paul was creepy already.
Yeah.
Which, because he was always talking about like raping bitches and stuff, and Val's like, why do you talk about women that way? Like, why are you like this? So they had brought these women over, and Paul was like, I guess like hooking up with her in the same room as Val, and then she like scratched his back like passionately or whatever, and he freaked out on her and was like, don't fucking scratch me, and threatened her with a knife, and Val was there. So he was just like, dude, what? This is very violent and terrifying. And Carla apparently just didn't care or didn't.
Was she on the trip too?
She wasn't there. She wasn't on the trip. But I believe at one point Paul had shown her a videotape of like, hey, look, I hooked up with this other woman. And Carla was basically like, well, if he hooks up with another woman, at least I won't be as abused. Like that, basically. So April 6th, 1991, Paul was hiding in the bushes back in Port Dalhousie when a 15-year-old girl was jogging by. He jumped out from behind her, grabbed her with one hand, and put a gloved hand over her mouth, dragged her into the bushes and violently anally raped her. Yeah, just like horrible. And then when he was done, he told her, don't call for help or I'm going to come back and kill you. But she did call for help from 2 guys walking by. She was like, that guy just raped me. And these 2 guys chased Paul, but he knew the area, so he was able to escape, which is so shitty. Could have caught him right there.
I was so ready to be like, and they caught him and brought him in, and like, that would be so sick.
I wish. So she was questioned by the police at the hospital when she went, and she gave a description of Paul. She said, he's blonde, about 6 feet tall, good looking, which you are debating. I mean, I think he looks like a creep, but.
I strongly disagree.
Yeah. And it was like, hey, this guy kind of looks like the Scarborough rapist.
He looks like a man baby. Like he's got a weird baby
Yeah,
face.
yeah, he is. Exactly. And that's what the composite photo of the Scarborough rapist looked like. But the police in the Niagara region, which is where St. Catharines is in, didn't connect with the police in Scarborough.
Right. They're not thinking he's a Scarborough rapist.
No. So they didn't pursue the possibility of a connection between this rape and the ones in Scarborough. One. Yeah. So at that point, mid-April, Paul had recently declared bankruptcy with more than $20,000 in debts, but he continued.
Told you about the credit card. Yeah, Paul.
Yeah. Should have thought that through.
Should have listened to me.
So he continued to want to keep up appearances. So they finalized plans for their expensive wedding that I believe both the parents were paying for, as well as a honeymoon in Hawaii. Why not spend more? So this is probably the only part of the case that I like. So Paul could sometimes still be nice to Carla, the way he was at the beginning of their relationship. And one day he agreed to get a dog, which Carla had always wanted, but previously he refused because he said he was allergic. So they got a Rottweiler named Buddy. That's my favorite part. They had a cute Rottweiler.
The fucking poor dog was just like,
I'll show you,
adopted or like bought by these 2.
I know. I'm sure the dog, like, I'm sure, yeah, it's not fair for the dog, but anything about a dog.
Yeah, but I'm sure too, is like somebody who's like experiencing a very abusive relationship. It's like,
here's a dog.
Well, like, yeah, you get something to like put like good energy towards. Yeah, so maybe she was really nice to the dog.
Right. I don't know. Apparently she was an animal lover. Honestly, everything I've read, it didn't seem like they like were that bad to the dog. I don't think they were great dog parents, but
I can't imagine they were great at anything.
Yeah. Let's get back to the bullshit that they were doing. So the next like crime that they committed that I know of, I read once again conflicting accounts of exactly when and how this took place, but one source that I read said that it took place on June 7th. So Carla had an acquaintance who was, I read different things. Some said she worked at the vet clinic or volunteered. Some said Carla knew her elsewhere. Anyway, she was 15 years old. They invited her over to their house. And this girl's identity has been kept off the record, I assume, because she's known as Jane Doe in this case.
She's a minor.
Yeah. So once again, Carla had agreed or decided, I don't know what it was, but she had stolen sleeping pills and halothane, that chloroform-like substance, from the vet clinic. So they invite Jane over. Also, I should say, again, read conflicting accounts. Some said that like they had invited Jane over multiple times because Paul was really into her. Paul was buying her gifts, blah, 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 but she didn't seem to want to initiate sexual contact. And Paul was just getting pissed and he was like, next time she comes over, we're just going to do it like this. So that, 15 years old. So they spiked Jane's drink, and when she passed out, Paul got out his camera, of course, and started recording. So here's what we know. Once again, Paul raped this young girl, both vaginally and anally, while Carla held a halothane-soaked rag over her mouth, and on tape, Carla joined in, performing oral sex on this girl. And on these tapes, Carla is shown seemingly in pleasure during this situation. So I don't know. Was Carla doing this to appease Paul, or was she genuinely getting off on this?
Either way, it's bad.
It's bad either way, but I think it's like there's a case to be made that, oh, Paul got super mad at me repeatedly for ruining the tape we made of Tammy being raped because she said she didn't want to be part of it. So there is a case to be made that she was like performing like she was liking it, but she really hated it. I don't know. But on the transcripts, it's describing her seeming to be into it. So it's hard to say, right?
And either way, like, I get you're an abuse victim and blah, 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 but, like, you let this happen and you drugged her and you're a part of that.
Yeah. Like, it doesn't matter how much stress you're under. You're
part of it.
Like, yeah, you're still responsible for that. So once again, while Paul was actually filming Karla assaulting Jane, they noticed that Jane started gagging and stopped breathing. So Karla called 911 and she was like, our friend is over. She passed out. But Paul was able to revive Jane, or I'm not sure if she just revived herself. So Karla was like, called back and was like, hey, canceled. Never mind. You guys don't have to come. And it was one of those things where usually the police would still come out just to be sure, but they didn't that time. And I also think it's interesting that they're like calling 911.
Yeah, like so quickly that like she like, because you'd have to think that they would be calling 911 in a pretty quick amount of time because she did become revived. Like, it wasn't like it
was right after they noticed. And it's like, so obviously you guys, I guess, didn't want her to die, but also you're really like implicating yourselves by doing
that's like
that.
Super suspicious because like how does she like wake up and not know what happened?
Yeah, well, yeah, I don't know. And so apparently they dressed Jane back up, they tucked her into bed, and in the morning they just joked with her like, girl, you passed out last night, like whatever, and
I guess
we're gonna drive you home.
On how they drug her, like you could just be like be groggy and pass out and not know.
Yeah,
right.
I think that and apparently from what I've read, she didn't realize what had happened to her. I think that like if you've been raped, you probably would feel like leftover pain from it. So it's possible that she didn't realize what happened because she was so groggy and out of it because they drugged her. But maybe she just didn't want to report it to anyone. Maybe she just felt uncomfortable about the situation and didn't want to say anything because
well, I think a number of things could be true, but also like you could wake up and be like your first thought is not that like the two people that you were
friendly with that were like buying gifts and
violently raped you after they drugged you. Like if you don't even think you were drugged, which I don't know how you would not be like something.
I mean, she was 15, so she probably didn't have a lot of experience drinking. True. So they probably gave her a couple drinks and they were like, oh, girl, you passed out. And she's like, yeah, I drank too much. I'm hungover. Maybe.
And I feel like you could think like, oh, maybe I have like period cramps or something. Yeah. Or like some sort of.
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah. She probably felt nauseous. She probably felt like other discomfort. So that happened. 3 weeks later, June 29th, 1991, Paul and Karla got married. The night before, at the rehearsal dinner, a friend of Karla's and also one of her bridesmaids both noticed that she had bruises on her arms since she was wearing a sleeveless dress. And I think it's very interesting that Karla didn't wear long sleeves to cover the bruises, which she could have. But when other people asked about them, which happened there and also had happened in other instances where people had noticed bruises on her, she would either say, oh, that's just from playing with my dog Buddy, or the animals at the vet clinic, or just like some accidental situation. So she would kind of like brush it off. But I still think it's interesting that she intentionally obviously displayed the bruises there.
And I think it's hard to like, as somebody else, like I think if somebody had bruises on them one time, like I probably wouldn't think they're being abused.
Not that big of a deal.
It's a pattern.
Yes,
that you start to recognize it.
And it's like, yeah, you work with animals, so some people bruise easily. Like, I guess it is kind of explainable, but it's also like weird. So on the day before the wedding, basically a lot of the guests were feeling really weird about what was going on because they were like, why does Karla have a bunch of bruises on her? That's kind of weird. Suspicious. Yeah, people were weirded out by it, but nobody actually followed through with like confronting either of them at that point. So they were just kind of like, it's their wedding. Like, let's be nice. So the day of the wedding, Paul and Karla put on a show of being a happy couple, even though Karla's family was pissed because they hadn't agreed to cut down the cost of the wedding or postpone it after Tammy's death. Paul was barely on speaking terms with his family, and they had been really shitty about planning, so they left all these like reservations to the last minute and made Karla's bridesmaids pick up the slack and rush to make calls. So it was all just like, looked like everyone was smiling, but everyone was not in a good mood. Kind of vibes with everything else that was going on in their relationship.
Yeah, see, this is where I'm just like, you two are just like fucking dicks. Like,
yeah,
not only are you doing all this like murder and raping and everything, but it's like then everybody else has to like sit there and applaud you while you have this like
questionable manslaughter or murder that we know of. But yeah, I know.
Well, that's what I mean. They murdered her. They killed her.
Yeah. So just the fact that they still wanted to do the wedding. I mean, whatever. I'm sure Paul was very forceful, being like, Karla, we're fucking doing this. And she was like, okay, Paul, whatever you say.
Yeah, but I think she fucking
But
loved
she
that
also
dress.
probably...
and their like little carriage. And
yeah,
all
they were in a carriage. We'll insert some photos.
Yeah, just like your guys' wedding was a lot.
Yeah, like I have the...
Maybe lay low.
The nice little carriage that they were in with a driver, with a horse, with their... Madison hates Karla's wedding dress. I mean, it's so just really ugly. Fluffy and ugly. Yeah.
It's just so like 90s, like fluffy.
Yeah, their fashion is very late 80s, early 90s, which I think is like we'll add a little nostalgia into the terrors of this case. But so they had their wedding, and later Karla would say she never wanted to marry Paul. And it is possible that this is true because, as we know, even though she's smiling in all these photos, she does not quite have a happy look in her eyes. Something you may even refer to as a dead look behind her eyes.
She does have a dead look behind
her eyes. Which, I mean, I'm sure her soul died at a certain point.
Absolutely.
And maybe it was when she raped and murdered her sister.
Maybe.
So, like I said, June 29th, 1991, day of their wedding. That very same day, a man and his son were fishing at a local lake in a shallow section about knee-high.
We know about... grandfathers and fathers fishing with their sons. Should they find them?
You're always going to find something. Yeah. It's just like, don't go fishing with your grandfather. No, a man and a son. Yeah. So they noticed several square objects at the bottom of the lake, and they decided to take a closer look. The objects were boxes made out of concrete, and some of the tops were coming off. When the man lifted the tops of the boxes off, he found parts of a dismembered corpse inside. These were the body parts of Leslie Mahaffey, a 14-year-old girl that had been abducted and repeatedly raped, beaten, and then murdered by Paul and Karla 2 weeks earlier.
Yeah, I remember that name.
2 weeks before their fucking wedding, they're doing this shit. So that's where I'm going to end it for today. Next time, we'll continue with describing those series of events. But we will leave it at that for now. So what do you think?
Well, I mean, I won't get too much into it, but, like, that's an escalation.
Yeah.
Chopping her up.
Yeah.
It's horrible.
An actual, like, murder, as opposed to 2 weeks earlier. So, interesting thing, the Leslie Mahaffey murder had been 2 weeks before, and some sources will date the Jane Doe rape after, some will date it before. But if it was before, which was in lethal marriage, then it was an escalation. Because Jane Doe, they raped her, and then they were like, girl, you passed out.
Yeah.
Whereas this girl...
But even towards, like, the killing or whatever we're calling that of the sister.
Right.
Like, they called 911 or whatever.
Yeah.
This is, like, they're, like, killed someone. And
chopped up her body.
Chopped her up.
Yep.
God
damn. That escalated.
This has been extremely disturbing, this episode.
Yeah.
It's been a lot.
It's a lot.
It's a lot.
And there's more.
Yeah.
There's plenty more. So originally I'd said I was going to do 3 parts. 1 on the like early life and times, whatever. 2 on the crimes, 3 on the aftermath. We're actually going to split up the crimes into a part 2, which was this, and another part 3. So I'm going to tell you guys about what happened with Leslie and what happened next in their little criminal arrangement before we get to part 4, which is going to be the aftermath. So...
yeah, we should stop saying how many parts it's going to be during part 1 because
we just keep adding more shit.
Never know. It's really hard.
There's a lot of details about this case too, which I think is very interesting, obviously. So I want to do it justice and like explain everything that happened in as fair of a way as possible, like lay the facts out. So honestly, after all that, like I kind of want to do a check-in of like how bad do we think Karla is? Because like Paul's obviously this like serial rapist.
Yeah.
Karla could be an unwilling accomplice at this point. We don't really know.
But she's an accomplice nonetheless.
Yeah.
And like, even if you're unwilling, you're a grown-ass woman.
Right. Well,
with
20,
a phone.
I mean.
I'm sorry.
You're too old to be murdered. Yeah,
like,
yeah.
You can't be a murderer. You can't blame being a victim on murdering people.
Like, there's a line.
You can't.
Yeah.
Even rape, you can't.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I agree. So... I think it's...
a lot of murderers and rapists and everything had like really shitty childhoods.
Right.
And I get that. And that sucks. And that's definitely a reason for why you have shitty behavior. And I feel for the child version of you. I really do. But the second you start abusing other people and killing other people.
Yeah. Like as an adult, you're responsible. And exactly. I think that it is, no matter what, unexcusable, obviously. But I want to understand the why. And that's why this like... enigmatic mystery of Karla just
Yeah, and it's especially because we don't know so much about her childhood and her like family life. So I'm curious to know.
Yeah, so that's
whereas with Paul, it's crystal clear.
We know what happened there. So we'll leave it at that for part 2, and we're going to be back next week with part 3. So get ready. Lots more gruesome detail to come. Be ready. Go hug your dog. Go call your mom and tell her you love her.
Yeah.
And remember,
and please share.
Yes, please share, guys. Comment on Instagram, follow, like, subscribe on YouTube.
Yeah.
We are on YouTube, if I did not casually mention that enough times in this episode. But, it's fun. You can see us. We put up visuals. Our producer, Aidan, inserts all the visuals. And I think it adds a lot of interest to the cases to have, like, some of these visual components. So you will see those. But if you are listening on Apple or Spotify, subscribe, rate, follow, all that stuff. We really appreciate it.
And if you're looking to chat with us, Instagram is where we do a lot of chatting.
Yeah, Instagram's good.
Feel free to email us.
At Who's Knocking Podcast. Our email is hello@whosknockingpodcast.com. We're still not doing anything on Twitter as of the recording of this episode, but at Who's Knocking Pod on Twitter.
We're very reachable.
Yeah, reach us. Let us know what you think. I mean, I think a lot of people who are in the true crime world know about this case. It's not like an obscure case by any means.
Especially Canadians.
Right, exactly. Like, we kind of all know about this, but I just really wanted to talk about it because it is so unbelievably interesting and just terrible and fascinating. Yeah. Right at the intersection of those two things.
I agree.
So thanks for listening. If you made it this far, we appreciate you. And don't forget to stay safe out there because you never know.
Who's knocking?
This podcast is produced in collaboration with Lost Line Media. Artwork by August Digital. Music by Matthew Cook.